Morning, everyone. I want to change gears a little bit regarding the vlogs that I've been doing for the last 2 years and moving somewhat, though not entirely, away from the present zeitgeist cultural and spiritual warfare that we're being subjected to, you know, for a long time, but it's really been ramped up with the beginning of, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. It's gone from that to 2 weeks to save Biden's biolabs in Ukraine. But I want to switch gears on this and talk about something that I think is extremely important. Within Ireland, a lot of the group of people that I personally would be like peers of, I'm talking about John Waters and Dave Cullen and all the other people around the scene who make videos and vlogs like James Collins and This Drinking Life and all, and the Irish Inquiry and everyone else, the Gemma O'Doherty and people are sort of like roughly, although we're not a group or a scene and we're all very different politically and other ways. I'm not political at all, but there's a general understanding that everyone kind of listens to my videos, listens to theirs, and there's this kind of thing going on. And Christian Morris and people like that, to all different degrees, from very popular people like Dave, all the way down sort of mid-group ones like me, and then down to like people who are just starting to get in and making their own vlogs. And we've reached a very big international audience. We have extended the reach of what we are talking about. I think because Irish people are naturally gifted at language, and we're very good at communication when we can communicate properly. And so far, if you look at people like, although what's going on here is addressable to your country, your region, whatever, your group, I use the term tribe because I don't want to be specifically parochial. I'm very much an international man. I've traveled extensively. I love overseas cultures. I love foreign cultures. I love old-fashioned multiculturalism. I love but I'm not chauvinistic about being Irish. Although I'm not saying accusing these other people of being that. I'm just saying I'm very careful to be not chauvinistic about being Irish because, firstly, I think I don't want to be pigeonholed within what I'm saying being exclusively held within this country, and secondly, I don't relate personally to what Irish nationalism is. And the main reason for this is because I'm not a Catholic or a Protestant. I'm a pagan, and it's very difficult since the last couple of hundred years to separate Irish identity from either things like Catholic emancipation or the Protestant Reformation. The two things play very heavily in the Irish consciousness to the point where I just call myself a cultural nationalist. But even the term cultural nationalist is a loaded term. It's one of the reasons I don't have anything to do with nationalist parties, is because even if the people who run those parties are well-minded and well-intentioned, decent people, unfortunately, they will attract knuckle scrapers too, which is terribly unfortunate, but that's just the nature of the game, sadly. It's to do things, mainly they're sort of like rejects from Sinn Féin, the Celtic jersey types who don't have a very low intellect. They're the ones who think they're fighting for Ireland when they're on their way to Poland right now to join up with the Ukrainians. And these people are generally not the kind of people I want to associate with. And sadly, that pushes me away from that kind of way of thinking. Am I proud to be Irish? Yeah, I guess I'm grateful that have this compared to other things. At the same time, too, I don't think I'm better than anyone else. I don't like anyone, regardless of where they're from, of being, ethnically chauvinistic. I'm not a fond of that at all. I think that I believe in kind of ethnic sense of self-security, and an appreciation for others. And that's how I feel, okay? I don't feel superior. I don't feel inferior. I don't feel like I have to please anyone. I don't feel I have to boast. But this video is to talk about the to move beyond Ireland. You'll see like the people like John will Waters will and Dave. They tend to be focused on Ireland. That's okay. We have the issues here to address, but there's a big wide gulf out there, and there's also an enormous untapped resource of the Celtic world as a whole. And this is why I want to talk about this, because I think one of the things that we can do, because it's already been proven in the past, to separate ourselves from globalization and move into a parallel existence is to re-establish our connection with the Celtic fringe. Now, the Celtic world is enormous. It's probably made up of people of Celtic origin, and not only living in Celtic lands, but the Celtic fringe is vital, and I'll explain to you why, of hundreds of millions of people. And that includes vast swathes of the United States, Canada, and Australia, and everywhere like that. The Celtic fringe is predominantly the nations of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the Isle of Man, or Manx, Brittany, and Cornwall. Now, beyond that, there are extended areas of Celtic influence, which would be seen like as the secondary Celtic far fringe. And you're talking about places like Galicia in northern Spain, northern Portugal, Nova Scotia, and even parts of the north of England in certain areas that through immigration, particularly Merseyside and Manchester, that have large Scottish and Irish populations and Welsh populations, they could be somehow also considered, and maybe even parts of London. Remember, London is probably named after the Celtic god Lu. Now, why is the Celtic, for now we'll just stick with the importance of, and many of you watching this who live all over the world will be of Celtic heritage, even beyond the ancestors of the Celtic fringe. Now, why is the Celtic fringe, and we're going to stick with that right now, so vital for the parallel society going forward and breaking from globalization, and why they're also attacking us? Why you have this horrific destruction of Irish identity in Ireland? You have this attacks by the SNP in Scotland against the Scottish identity, Bolsheviks in the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon, and so on. And on it goes, it's going on all these countries, but particularly Ireland and Scotland are getting particularly hammered. And always have been. There's a reason for this. Now, so we'll stick with the Celtic fringe, okay? So that would be Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Manx, Cornwall, and Brittany, okay? Now, the reason why this region is so important is because it's an ancient repository of much of the history of the Western world. Remember, Tolkien created the Middle Earth cycle because the Anglo-Saxon invasion, and then following that, the Norman invasion in particular, wiped out much of that great heritage of England, of pre-Anglo-Saxon, pre-Norman England. So it was all lost. And this is why Tolkien drew heavily, and many other writers not from the Celtic world writing fantasy drew heavily, you think of it like Conan the Barbarian and so on, drew heavily from Celtic mythology. And the reason for this is it's a repository of the ancientness of Europe. When the Roman Empire expanded, the Celtic people ended up basically, now we're not all one race, remember that, we're not all the same race, we're quite different, but we have a common linguistic and cultural connection and a spiritual connection that's identical across all these lands. So basically the people are the same in their spiritual state, even though they come from different tribes. For instance, the Welsh are not the same as the Irish. They're both Celtic people, but the Welsh are Brittonic Celts, the Irish are Gaelic Celts. But they're still part of the same world. And so that's the importance of the Celtic thing. Now, Ireland, quite rightly, since independence in particular, but before independence, you had things like the Gaelic League. The Gaelic League was a magnificent organisation. The Gaelic League was founded by people like Douglas Hyde, who became the first president of Ireland. And you can go to Owenighat Caves, Queen Maeve Land, the cave of the Morrigan, and actually see where he carved his name on the wall when he was a young man. He was tapped into the Irish spirit. He was, even though he was a Protestant like Lady Gregory and Yeats, these people revived Celtic culture because they saw the value in it beyond their own cultures, which would have been kind of like Anglo, Protestant Irish, and furnished this. And the Gaelic League not only encouraged things like the revival of the Irish language. I think when the Gaelic League was founded, there was something like 6,000, six Irish language books a year were published in Ireland. Now there's something like 6,000. Even though the use of Gaelic language in daily communication has died off, there's probably still, there's more of a Gaelic consciousness now in Ireland than there ever was. It's just not spoken as an everyday language, but that's unfortunate, but that's a whole other matter. But they also did things like revive Gaelic artwork, design, engineering, even things like engineering and stuff like that. They had exhibitions by people who had developed things in artwork. It was just creation of new ceramics and stuff like that. Glass blowing, where this is where the whole idea of Waterford glass came from and all this kind of thing. The revival of ancient crafts, metallurgy, jewellery particularly. And this is why today, all over the world, people wear Celtic jewellery, Celtic tattoos, have Celtic art on them, even if they're not of Celtic background. It just appeals to them. And that's because of people like Douglas Hyde and the Gaelic League back in the 1880s, again, very important at the time, that 1880s, and reviving it. Unfortunately, it was taken over by Sinn Féin, who after the turn of the century, politicised it and basically filled it full of more militant people, and that's just the way it went. But its legacy was enormous. When the Irish state was founded, you could look at all the graphic design, stunning Celtic artwork on government documents, stamps, money, absolutely gorgeous. All kinds of that kind of thing, like the Celtic identity through the actual aesthetic was reinforced. And this inspired groups in Wales and Scotland and Manx and Brittany and Cornwall to follow suit. And there was a tap was put into the ancient soul. It was revived, okay? And it was hugely successful. Now, this just because of, say, exhibitions held in Dublin in the 1880s by people who were kind of laughed at as seen as being annoying romantics at the time, is the reason why Japanese people today are wearing Celtic tattoos. Indian people are wearing Celtic jewellery. People in America of any ethnic background, even black people, are wearing Celtic design patterns. It came from that, which shows you the power of the Celtic cultural thing. If you focus on the cultural and not the political elements of it, how it can plant a seed, because what it does is it unleashes ancient codes in people and says to them, that's me. And also, wow, that's rather nice. So this is why culture trumps politics any day of the week. This is why all these SJWs, progressives, socialists, liberals, they're all doomed, because every expression of their existence is fundamentally and absolutely rooted in political ideology. It doesn't come from the soul. It doesn't come from the self. It doesn't come from anything of beauty. It comes directly and utterly from elements of political imperatives. And this is why it's doomed, because it's not rooted in the heart or the soul, where something like Celtic culture absolutely is rooted in the heart. And the early Christian churches that came to Ireland, unfortunately, these people also destroyed what was here, but they looked at it. The reason why you have this beautiful iconography surrounding early Celtic mysticism, Christian mysticism in Ireland, has nothing to do with a rabbi nailed to a plank in the Middle East, and has everything to do with the Celtic culture that was here beforehand. Remember, the Goban Sayer, the Irish smith, the artist, the artisan, the creator, became on Gobanu in the Christian pantheon, and they claim that he built when all these early ancient monastic beautiful sites of craftsmanship did not just happen like that when the Christians arrived. These Irish Celtic pagan artists already had these skills and this sense of artistry and engineering, and were just able to like get contracts and build Christian monastic settlements. And look at the Celtic cross and the crosses all over the Celtic world, and the incredible artistry in them. That was already here. This is why I don't believe that things like the Ardar chalice is actually Christian. I think it was actually a pagan cauldron that the Christians, because there's not one single Christian element on it, and it's filled with pictures of dragons and stuff like that. So therefore, which would be considered devils according to the early Christians who were basically Jewish who came to this country and saw all iconography as evil. They just saw you couldn't do anything. Now, so like in terms of pictorial form. So, this is how powerful this thing, the Christians were smart enough to actually, and the Roman invaders, as they should really be called, of Ireland, were smart enough to figure this out and say, this stuff is absolutely dynamite. We need to incorporate it into our proselytization. And so, therefore, this is why people associate St. Paddy's Day with Celtic spirals and triskeles and all these pagan iconography that already existed prior to that. Now, so that's the power of it, that a simple series of exhibitions in Dublin in the 1880s and 1890s could revive a 2,000-year-old culture and put it in a position whereby 30 years later, 40 years later, it had liberated. Ireland is still the only Celtic country that's independent. And I'm not saying that you have to be independent. You can function perfectly well in Cornwall being part of the UK, or in Brittany being part of France. It doesn't matter in being in Nova Scotia being part of Canada. What we have is transcendent of political identities. It's far more important and powerful. If you are of Celtic heritage, and most of you are, even if you think you're not, remember the Celtic world extended all the way from the west coast of Ireland once into Anatolia and Turkey. Just about everybody reading this at some part of their body will have a Celtic genetic background in them. These are codes to be unleashed. When you think of the Celts and outside things like artwork and music and literature and poetry, what do you really think about? Freedom. From Vercingetorix and the Gauls taking on the might of Rome, to the independence movements in Ireland, to the Molly Maguires in Australia, to the Irish coal miners who had their, so the Molly Maguires, I think, got them mixed up, from Ned Kelly in Australia, the Molly Maguires in America, the Irish Celtic soul, the Celtic soul as a whole, the Scottish at, Bannockburn. There's a belief there in that, we're not going to be held under the yoke of great empires. We are going to be what we want to be, because what we have is enough for us. And the whole thrust since just the time of Julius Caesar, and if you read the classical writings of the Celtic peoples put down by the Romans and the Greeks, they're very unflattering. But remember the war propaganda. That's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with war propaganda. But at the same time, too, there was begrudging respect for them also. And this is so important, so very important, because it's something truly ancient we have in us that goes far, far. It doesn't matter if your ancestors came from Bohemia, Anatolia, and Turkey, from the Danube regions of Eastern Europe. You have Celtic ancestry in you. You don't have it to the same degree that the ones in the Celtic fringe have, but that's why it's so important. The Celtic fringe is the repository of the ancient European Western soul. It's there. It still exists. And it still exists to this day. But they're doing everything to try and erase it. And how they're erasing it is by watering it down, by just making it into multicultural mush. Okay, it, but at the same time too, Celtic culture lends itself to technological changes in popular culture, and we see that in everything from music, like Clannad's when they brought the synthesizers in, to things like, you know, even Michael Flatley and the whole dance shows he put together, video games, comics, it's all there. You know, and rock music, it's everywhere. There's something about the Celtic thing, it flows seamlessly into the tangent because it comes from the ancient world long before the rules of measurement and precision took hold. This is why one of the reasons I'm so totally against people talking about the megalithic measurement, the megalithic yard. These people didn't live in a world of extreme measurements. This is a Freemasonic, Romanistic, Jesuitic notion placed upon our ancestors. Their ancestors built things in a very different way than the obsession with the measurements of units. They were more like artists. Does a glass cutter who's cutting glass use precise geometric measurements? No, they just go in. The same with most people who do Celtic art don't create quadrants and squares and put the spirals in that way. They flow artistically from the subconscious mind to the surface to the nervous system and the end of the tips of their fingers. The same with language. People always say to me, geez, you've definitely a way with words. I have a way with words because this is my ancestors talking through me, because I remain very much an embodiment of what the Celtic fringe is. I am a direct lineage of the bards and the druids. I'm not saying I'm one of them, but I definitely know that I've carried that energy force with me through my adult life, and it's served me very well. I just checked yesterday, between this channel and the other Thomas Sheridan channel, I have over 10 million subscribers. And that's just from me talking. The power of the words of conviction can undo the greatest political strategy. And the simplicity of the aesthetic beauty can bring down empires, or halt them at least. And this is why the Celtic fringe must be protected at all costs, because it is the final outpost in the Western world against the beast, the monster, the crawling, creeping abyss of globalization that seeks to destroy us all and make us robots. It is they have polluted and poisoned the culture to the point where Irish morons are going off to die like dogs in the Ukraine, but they wouldn't do it for Ireland. They wouldn't do it but we'll do it for our Celtic people. This is what's happening in Scotland, and this is what Nicola Sturgeon's brief is to destroy the Scots. Nicola Sturgeon should be called the Hammer of the Scots. Leo Varadkar should be called the Hammer of the Gaels. Macron in France should be called the Hammer of the Bretons. Trudeau in Canada should be called the Hammer of the Nova Scotians. You see where this is going? We have within us a power that transcends anything that they can computate, measure, formulate, strategize, and put into implementation, already inherent within us. And it's not just the Celtic people, it's all over the world, in every culture. But it's particularly powerful and meaningful because Western culture controls the planet. And we in the Celtic fringe, and those of us of Celtic ancestry, which is nearly all of you watching this, have within you, and perhaps even is the reason why you're in the tribe, is because just me using the word tribe over the last 2 years has done something to people. It has kicked them out of a miasma of confusion and brought them into a place where, yeah, there is another way to live beyond voting for asshole politicians or writing letters to newspapers or going to the courts. There is another way. And that other way is to the parallel society as us and our family and our friends, or even me on my own, living independently of this insanity of the technocrats and their globalization. And this is why the Celtic fringe is so important. This is why I fly the Celtic flag. I don't fly the Irish flag, although the Irish flag is in the Celtic flag. I fly the Celtic flag. And I love when I go to Cornwall, and I love when I go to Scotland and I see in Wales and I see the Celtic flag flying. Because the fringe, look, go out onto eBay, Amazon, anywhere now. Go and buy the Celtic flag. It's the one I'm using for the thumbnail for this thing. Regardless if what your religion, race is, if you're of Celtic heritage, and fly that flag. I know a lot of Americans have flagpoles on their fly that flag. Put it on your bedroom wall. Put it in your living room wall. Spend the €5, whatever it costs, to make that flag. It doesn't matter if it's made in a Chinese sweatshop. It's what it represents that's important. And fly that Celtic flag. And let's revive the Celtic fringe. We are a spiritual people. We are a tribe that can embrace other tribes. And I don't mean that in a kind of diversity sense. I mean, there's people who don't think of themselves as being Celtic origin. Maybe they're of Greek background or anything, Germanic or anything, but they will have that in their past. And if we can keep the Celtic fringe strong, that will bring back the Saxon fringe, the Nordic fringe. You go to Norway and the Scandinavian general, the biggest tragedy of all is, where the hell are the Vikings gone? Where the hell are the Norsemen gone? We can be a beacon for all the other tribes, the Hellenics, the Slavics, to revive themselves beyond the political, beyond the religious, beyond all that stuff. Now, I'm going to be doing a talk in the west coast of Ireland. Sorry, in the east coast of Ireland, somewhere between Dublin and Belfast. I'm not going to name the place just yet. It's not going to be Drogheda or Dundalk, by the way. But it'll be in the east coast of Ireland, not too far from Dublin. In April 21st, which is a Thursday night, I'll announce the venue and the location close to it. And I want to begin a spiritual revival, not as Christians, not as anything, but in a sense that everyone can actually, because everything we're dealing with now is a spiritual battle. All of it. None of it is not. Nothing that we're dealing with now is not a spiritual battle. And it's spiritual warfare being put upon us. And now that we know the rules of engagement, it's now time to put up the firewall, yes, but also to furnish the spirit of the ancestors, because that has a power that's greater than anything that can be thrown of us. Think of King Thoradin. When it was all was lost at Helm's Deep, he mounted on his steer and he rode through the keep directly at the orcs and defeated them. Because that power, and he gave a speak about the history of the Rohim and the people of Rohan. And that's how you should all feel regardless of your tribe. And I think the greatest place to begin this is in the Celtic fringe, because so many of us have a thing of this, a connection to us. Go out and buy a Celtic flag and fly it. And if someone asks you what you are, and you'll say, that's not Tony Blair, that's not Tony Fauci, that's not Leo Varadkar, that's not Nicola Sturgeon, that's not Justin Trudeau, that's not the World Economic Forum, that's not Henry Kissinger, that's not Joe Biden, that's not anything except my spirit, my soul, and the future of my tribe. Go out and do it. And I'll talk to you next time, and take care. You exist beyond what they tell you you are.